Hey there, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're heading back in time, not to the glory of emperors or grand battles, but into the crumbling alleyways and crowded apartments of everyday ancient Rome. This isn't the story you learned in school. This is the other side of history, where rats roam the streets, public toilets offer no privacy, and dinner is a gritty hunk of bread chased with watered-down wine. You'll step into the worn sandals of a regular Roman citizen, navigating dirty streets, sour smells, unsafe buildings and sleepless nights, all told in a gentle, calming tone, designed to help you unwind and drift into sleep. So fluff your pillow, close your eyes, and get ready to explore a day in ancient Rome that'll make your mattress feel like royalty. Let's begin. Imagine this. You open your eyes, and the first thing you notice isn't the light streaming in through curtains or the smell of coffee brewing. Instead, it's the damp, heavy air clinging to your skin and the sour, earthy scent of mildew. The walls around you are rough stone, cracked in places, and streaked with dark stains that suggest water's been creeping through them for decades. Above you, the wooden ceiling sags visibly, groaning occasionally under the weight of the apartment stacked precariously on top of yours. If you're lucky, it's still intact. If you're not, there might be a pile of shingles and debris on your floor later today. Welcome to life in an insula, Rome's version of low-income housing. Despite what those movies about ancient Rome might have you believe, most Romans didn't wake up in sprawling marble villas with mosaic floors. Insulae, or tenement blocks, were where the bulk of the city's population lived, crammed together like sardines in multi-story death traps. These buildings were notorious for their shoddy construction. Cheap wood and bricks slapped together in a hurry made them quick to erect, but just as quick to decay. Thousands of Romans lived in these multi-level buildings, and the higher you climbed, the worse it got. Sure, the top floors might mean you'd escape the occasional flooding on the ground level, but they came with their own hazards. Thinner walls, weaker floors, and no escape if a fire broke out. Which, by the way, happened a lot. Here's the thing about insulae. They looked a lot better from the outside than they felt to live in. Walking by one, you might catch glimpses of balconies or small windows, a facade of functionality. But step inside, and the illusion crumbles. The walls often leaked in the rain. Stone couldn't breathe the way modern construction does, leaving rooms perpetually slick and smelling of rot. Mildew wasn't just a mild inconvenience. It was basically a roommate. In these conditions, you'd share your bed not just with family members, but probably with lice as well, scurrying in and out of the straw mattress. They bit and crawled as you slept, so if the creaking neighbors or squawking chickens didn't wake you first, a sharp itch well might. Bathrooms. Forget about that. If you were lucky, your living space included a small chamber pot tucked into the corner. Using it wasn't glamorous, especially since cleaning these things wasn't exactly high on anyone's list of chores back then. The pot's contents had to be emptied, and because there were no plumbing systems in your insula, the most straightforward solution was tossing it straight out the window. This contributed to what you might call an informal sprinkler system for pedestrians below. They might shout curses, you'd draw your shutters, and life went on. And though you'd think such a cramped, chaotic situation would demand a bit of neighborly silence, the complete opposite was true. From the moment morning broke, insulae were a symphony of sound. Babies crying, pots clattering, chickens clucking. Any barrier between you and the next family over might as well not exist. And that's not even considering the countless arguments. Living in such tight quarters bred frustration. and those thin walls were witnesses to every unfiltered quarrel about debts, diets, or disobedient children. Some of it might be amusing, if not for the understanding that every outburst was really just another echo of how hard survival was here. Yet for all its discomfort, the insula wasn't just a building. It was a physical reminder of exactly where you stood in Roman society. This wasn't housing designed to improve lives. It was simply there to keep as many people under one roof as possible. The wealthier you were, the closer to the ground you lived. Those prime spots on the lower floors offered quicker exits during emergencies and slightly better ventilation. The higher up you went, the cheaper and far more dangerous things became. The ceilings got lower, the walls thinner, and the risk of falling through a rotten floorboard grew higher. For the poor majority of Rome, these risks weren't optional. They were daily realities. Fire, though, was the real nightmare most dreaded. Insulae were packed together so tightly that all it took was one stray ember or tilted oil lamp to set off a blaze that jumped from roof to roof like a wildfire, taking dozens of lives with it. If you were asleep when flames erupted, escaping from the top floor often meant flinging oneself into the chaos of the streets below. Even without fire, collapse was a constant threat. Builders cut corners whenever possible because wealthy landlords prioritized profit over safety. Material quality wasn't exactly inspected thoroughly when erecting residential blocks to cram in more tenants. There were laws attempting to limit the height of these buildings. Augustus himself set it at 70 Roman feet. But enforcing it was another story entirely. And yet, this was home. This damp, creaking, densely packed box of stone and wood was where many Romans woke up every day, rubbed sleep from their eyes, and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. No one living in these insulae expected comfort. Your day started knowing that survival wasn't guaranteed, but simply more likely than not. That was enough. Somehow, people made it work. For you, though, well, your day is only beginning, and your first task after climbing out of a straw-stuffed bed isn't particularly glamorous. That chamber pot you may have used earlier, you're going to want to walk that a few blocks away to empty it properly. There's no plumbing here, no private toilets. Romans of your class had to rely on the public latrines, those infamous communal bathrooms you've probably heard about. Mostly, it's less by choice and more by necessity, because keeping bodily functions contained within these insular walls would quickly make the air unbearable. So toss on a rough tunic. Watch out for loose floorboards as you weave your way past neighbors already arguing over who spilled water on whose side of the landing, and head downstairs. Think you've had a bad bathroom experience? Let me stop you right there. Whatever came to mind will start to seem like a spa day after you hear about ancient Rome's public latrines. Now, Romans were innovators in many ways, but when it came to toilets, they opted for function over just about everything else, including dignity and hygiene. Let's set the scene. You arrive at the latrina, a communal restroom that's less of a private retreat and more of a social mixer with a particularly unfortunate ambience. Picture a long stone bench, or maybe don't picture it if you're eating right now, dotted with evenly spaced holes. There's no partition, no dividers. You're seated elbow to elbow with strangers, all of whom are here for the exact same reason. The Romans didn't exactly prioritize your personal space in this setup. Privacy was more of a luxury than a right, and in the latrina, it simply didn't exist. Instead, people treated this public restroom kind of like a modern-day coffee shop, but instead of lattes, they brought, well, other contributions. A businessman might discuss grain prices with the fellow squatting next to him, or a retired soldier might ramble on about his bad knees. Whatever was on their mind became the conversation of the moment, and you didn't have much choice but to listen. Even if you weren't a willing participant in the dialogue, every sound in the room, whether it was conversational or otherwise, echoed off the stone walls. The whole setup was a perfect storm of awkwardness and exposure. Now, let's address the detail you've probably been wondering about, but might not want to hear. How did they clean up? Enter the tessorium, the not-so-heroic hero of Roman hygiene. This ingenious invention was a sponge attached to a stick, and it wasn't just for you. No, it was communal, shared by everyone who cycled through the latrina that day. After use, the tessorium was dipped in a bucket of vinegar or salt water for a quick rinse. The ancient equivalent of sanitization, though it's safe to say it wasn't exactly thorough. You were then expected to use that same sponge for your own purposes, rinsing it again for the next person. And while the Romans probably liked to think this was an effective system, let's just say the sponge had seen things that no amount of vinegar could erase. If you were particularly unlucky, the water in the bucket it was stored in might already be lukewarm and murky by the time your turn came up. Charming, right? And yet, despite the unsanitary reality, these latrini weren't just tolerated. They were a vital part of Roman urban life. For one thing, public urination was illegal, and fines were strictly enforced. Stepping into an alley and relieving yourself might save you a trip to the latrina, but it could also land you in hot water with local officials. Roman law wasn't known for its leniency, which means dodging a public restroom wasn't really an option. That forced reliance made the latrinae a central hub of the community. They weren't just toilets. They were public spaces where people gathered, talked, and sometimes even conducted business. If anything, they were another example of how the Romans embraced communal living, even in ways that most of us would prefer to avoid entirely. There's an irony in how advanced the Romans were with their engineering. Their aqueducts were marvels of the ancient world, providing running water to cities and even flushing waste out of latrinae through troughs of flowing water beneath the seats. In theory, this kept the waste moving and the space cleaner. In practice, well, let's just say things didn't always work as smoothly as planned. Sometimes the water wouldn't flow fast enough to carry everything away, leaving unpleasant reminders of the restroom's purpose right under your nose. And because latrinae were open to everyone, you couldn't exactly demand better service. You could only grin, bear it, and hope your neighbor wasn't in the mood for a long-winded rant about politics while you were sitting there. Hygiene wasn't just an issue with the tessorium or the waste system. It extended to what happened or didn't happen when people finished their business. Forget soap. Water was sometimes available for rinsing your hands, but it was stored in communal basins that likely saw more hands than anyone would care to count. Washing up was less about getting clean and more about making a token gesture toward the idea of hygiene. And yes, these basins were often reused throughout the day, which contributed to the spread of disease. It's no wonder that public latrinae became hotspots for all kinds of illnesses. Sitting there, using shared tools and water, and then returning to your daily life without proper sanitation, turned these restrooms into a breeding ground for trouble. Even the built environment of the latrinae played a part in this communal nightmare. The acoustics inside were something else entirely. Stone walls, open spaces, and echoing sounds meant you couldn't escape the very public reminders of what was happening around you. It was a sensory experience at every level, and not the kind anyone looked forward to. In a way, the latrini weren't just about solving a basic human need. They were about reinforcing the Roman tendency to prioritize practicality and efficiency over comfort. Why bother with privacy or separate facilities when one big room could get the job done, however unpleasant that job was? But for all their flaws, the latrine weren't optional. If you lived in the cramped, unsanitary insulae we discussed earlier, chances are you didn't even have a proper chamber pot. A trek to the nearest latrina was part of your daily routine, no matter how tired or unclean you felt. And while the fines for public urination might have been a significant incentive, so were the social pressures. Romans were deeply communal in most aspects of life. Going to a shared bathroom was just another form of participation in the collective experience of city living. Whether you were there to relieve yourself, share gossip about a neighbor, or just avoid a penalty, the latrina served its purpose, albeit messily. Still, let's make one thing clear. Visiting the public restroom wasn't just inconvenient or awkward, it was a challenge to endure. You had to navigate the discomfort of sharing a space with strangers. You had to trust that the tessorium had been rinsed properly, even if you had your doubts. You had to deal with the smells, the sounds, and the ever-present risk of getting sick from the unsanitary conditions. Going to the bathroom was less about relief and more about survival, a quick lesson in making the best of a bad situation. And then it was over. You left the latrina, maybe a little relieved, but certainly not refreshed, and continued your day. By this point, you're probably hungry, but don't look forward to anything too delicious waiting for you. Breakfast was up next, if you could even call it breakfast. It wasn't eggs and bacon, or even a pile of fresh fruits. Instead, you had something far less inspiring. Stale bread and wine watered down to make sure it lasted longer. Not exactly the fuel you'd want to kick off a day full of back-breaking labor. But hey, in ancient Rome, food wasn't about satisfaction. It was about staying upright just long enough to make it through the next ordeal. Forget pancakes and coffee. Your breakfast in ancient Rome has no syrup-drizzled stacks or comforting mugs of caffeine to greet you. Instead, you start the day with the bare minimum. Panis rusticus, a dense, coarse bread that's more function than flavor, washed down with watered-down wine. There's no ceremony to any of this. You're either leaning against a wall or squatting near a public fountain to eat, while the sounds of arguing merchants and clattering carts drive home the fact that you're firmly in survival mode. Roman mornings weren't about indulgence, they were about getting through what was coming next. Let's talk about the bread, because you're going to be chewing on it for a while. This lump of panis rusticus isn't the soft, fluffy kind of bread you might picture on a dining table. No, this is essentially a chunk of hardened grain, likely baked several days ago and stored since. Its texture has been described as a rough, chewy lump of grain and grit, which might lead you to wonder if you're eating bread or just trying to sand down your teeth. Thick and dry, it takes effort just to bite off a piece, let alone swallow it. Each bite grinds like sandpaper, leaving crumbs to linger in your mouth and a faint sensation that your jaw is already tired. And it's not even lunch yet. The taste? Let's just say it's consistent with its appearance. The bread offers no surprises, no sweetness, no rich buttery softness. It's simply there, performing its one job, giving you calories. If you're lucky, maybe you've dipped it in olive oil, or if you're really splurging, smeared a bit of garum on top. Now, garum was a fermented fish sauce used to add flavor to many Roman dishes. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of ketchup. except this ketchup had the distinctive quality of what's been called aromatic horror. It's pungent, to put it mildly, with a smell so sharp it likely competed with the general odors of the city around you. Still, any bit of salt or flavor breaks the monotony of this otherwise grim little meal. And then there's the wine. It's not the rich, full-bodied glass you're imagining. The wine you're drinking is watered down. Sometimes so heavily, it's closer to grape-tinted water than anything you'd recognize as wine. This wasn't just for taste purposes. Romans frowned upon intoxication early in the day, except, of course, if you were wealthy enough to disregard social norms altogether. For you, though, the watery wine is a necessity. It's meant to last longer and reduce the risk of drunkenness before you head off to whatever miserable work the day has in store. The setting for this meal does nothing to elevate it. If you're picturing a cozy breakfast nook, let that image go. Romans didn't have designated dining rooms for breakfast, especially not those living in cramped, overcrowded insulae. Instead, you're likely standing in the street or squatting near a public fountain, eating with a level of enthusiasm that matches the meal itself. Around you, other Romans are doing the same, each focused on chewing their way through their own stale ration. While breakfast was technically a communal experience, it wasn't really a social one. There's no sense of connection or conversation, just quiet chewing, a few muffled coughs, maybe a grunt or two. Of course, not everyone was stuck with such meager breakfasts. The rich always managed to find a way to live well, even first thing in the morning. A wealthier Roman might have had access to a touch of fruit, maybe even a drizzle of honey to sweeten their bread. For most, though, luxury wasn't on the menu. The majority made do with the basics because breakfast wasn't about comfort. It was about getting just enough energy to endure the day ahead. Food was fuel, nothing more, and as far as fuel went, it was barely enough to get the engine going. It's also worth noting what's missing from this breakfast. There's no coffee to jolt you awake, no eggs or bacon, or even a simple piece of fresh fruit for balance. The Romans didn't have access to these ingredients, so the breakfast you're struggling through was never going to be anything more than a pale shadow of what you might call a meal today. Your morning starts with dry bread, mild dehydration, and the dawning realization that you're about to walk miles or do heavy labor on an empty stomach. And that's the best case scenario for the average Roman. Now, let's say you finished choking down the last crumb of bread and taken a final swig of watered wine. You're not exactly satisfied. There's no lingering sense of fullness or warmth in your belly. But you're no longer hungry enough to be distracted. This, apparently, is the goal. The Romans weren't interested in breakfast as an opportunity for enjoyment or creativity. The practical mindset of the time meant it was purely a functional experience. You ate what you needed to keep upright, and that was the end of it. Anything more, like flavor or variety, was considered unnecessary. This simple, utilitarian approach to eating reflected the broader Roman attitude toward necessity and excess. For the average citizen, food wasn't something to be celebrated. It was something to be endured. Meals like this one were a daily reminder of the limited resources and demanding lifestyle that defined life in ancient Rome. Even when it came to nourishing themselves, most people lived on the edge, never quite indulging, just surviving. With breakfast behind you, the next challenge awaits: work. Whether you're a laborer, a porter, or perhaps one of the many Romans whose work involved hauling, cleaning, or constructing, you won't have much downtime today. The bread and wine you've consumed will have to carry you through grueling hours in the sun, surrounded by the noise and grit of the city. You'll walk miles in thin sandals, bending, lifting, sweating, all while knowing that this is just another typical day, one of many that look exactly the same. So, you brush the crumbs off your tunic, take a shallow breath, and make your way into the bustling chaos of the Roman streets. As your stomach starts to settle, so does the knowledge that the day ahead will be long, difficult, and anything but comfortable. Breakfast has done its job, but it hasn't done much else. It's time to move on to work, where the real test of endurance begins. Unless you happen to be born into wealth, the Roman Empire had a special kind of workday waiting for you. Brutal, exhausting, and dangerous, with no room for mistakes or complaints. When the sun barely began to rise, you'd already be stepping outside, stomach half empty from breakfast, to begin a long stretch of toil. Just like that stale bread you choked down earlier, the work itself wasn't meant to bring satisfaction. It was about survival, no more, no less. For most Romans, work revolved around manual labor. You might find yourself hauling supplies as a porter, constructing yet another public building as a bricklayer, or maintaining the cramped, disease-ridden streets as a cleaner. If you had the misfortune of ending up as a sewer worker, your job took you beneath the city, wading through ankle-deep human waste to keep the pipes flowing, without gloves, without masks, without any regard for your health. But hey, someone had to do it, and odds were good that someone wasn't going to be anybody wealthy. Bricklayers and other laborers began their day before sunrise. By the time light stretched across the city, they were already sweating under the weight of their tasks. Supervisors, think of them as low-budget, ancient foremen, patrolled work sites barking orders, often armed with sticks. If you were caught slacking or late, the consequences might range from verbal abuse to a quick shove. For the most part, punctuality wasn't negotiable. Miss a day or lose a job, and you wouldn't just be unemployed. You'd be homeless. In a city where your wages barely stretched to pay for the rat-infested corner of an insula, skipping work wasn't an option. Safety equipment? Forget it. Helmets, gloves, or any kind of protection were unheard of. Your only gear consisted of a simple tunic and maybe a pair of worn sandals. If you were hauling bricks or stones, you'd use your bare hands and the sheer endurance of your body, until, of course, something gave out. Injuries were common, from crushed fingers to sprained backs, but there was no compensation and certainly no time to rest. A bad enough injury meant more than being stuck at home. It could end your ability to work entirely. For sewer workers, the grind was an entirely different category of hardship. Their job involved crawling through tight, filthy tunnels, prying loose clogs of waste, and dealing with a smell that would cling to their skin and clothes for days. There wasn't much daylight in these spaces either, and torches could only do so much. The risk of cave-ins or suffocation was ever present, but unless there was a serious injury or a tragedy, the work didn't stop. You'd finish the day covered in muck, barely able to scrub the memories off. Street cleaners might not have been crawling through filth, but their jobs weren't exactly a day in the park either. They spent hours sweeping garbage, scooping up horse droppings, and doing what they could to maintain the public spaces, all to avoid the city descending further into chaos. And yet, for all their effort, the streets weren't what anyone would call clean. Sewage, rotting food, and assorted refuse were regular features of the landscape, and just one misstep could send someone tumbling into a particularly unpleasant pile. Yes, they helped clear the streets, but the streets always seemed to fight back. And if you were a porter, well, congratulations. You'd won the prize for repetitive back-breaking labor. Day after day, porters carried goods across the city. Sacks of grain, blocks of marble, crates of wine. The weight of these loads could destroy a person's posture long before middle age. Walking mile after mile in sandals that barely cushioned your feet, you'd feel every pebble beneath your soles. The reward: a day's wage so small that it barely covered your rent. But at least you weren't stuck underground, right? Even jobs like pottery or brickmaking weren't glamorous. Pottery sounds peaceful until you realize it's messy, repetitive, and leaves your hands caked in clay that dries into impossible cracks. These bricks weren't just for building Rome's next great structure. They were your finger's least favorite enemy, cutting into your skin with every thrown batch. There was no art to it. Most people weren't making decorative pieces for wealthy homes. They were tossing together practical plates, storage jars, or plain bricks as quickly as humanly possible to keep up with demand. The only solace was the satisfaction of surviving another day. The women of Rome weren't spared either. While men toiled in the city's demanding labor roles, women were often responsible for spinning and weaving, managing market stalls, or selling small goods like vegetables and bread. These weren't leisurely activities, but non-stop physical efforts that required constant focus. And when they weren't spinning wool or keeping the economy afloat in small ways, they were also cooking, cleaning, and juggling child-rearing duties. It was a relentless balancing act, one that most people rarely described as fulfilling. And then you had the hierarchy of pain. Social status determined everything, from your profession to the smallest details of your daily life. The wealthiest Romans, of course, never lifted a finger. Even middle-class citizens could avoid the back-breaking labor of manual work. But for the lower classes, you were at the mercy of jobs that prioritized production over well-being. There was no room for error and no hope of climbing the ladder. Once your body gave out, you became dead weight in a system that had no patience for failure. Each day blurred into the next. The work started early, ran long, and rewarded you poorly. Vacations didn't exist. Holidays provided only brief respite, and the physical toll piled on with each passing week. For most Romans in these occupations, the work wasn't about mastering a craft or building a career. It was about making it through to the next day alive. Survival was the only real measure of success. As the day came to an end, exhaustion didn't mean safety. You still had to navigate the crowded, chaotic streets of Rome, dodging carts and criminals while avoiding open sewage and stray animals. Streets were an extension of the city's challenges: loud, filthy, unpredictable, and dangerous. Just because the workday was over didn't mean the struggle was. And as you made your way home, you were reminded once again of where you stood in the grand order of things. At the bottom, hoping for enough strength to do it all again tomorrow. The life of a Roman laborer wasn't about achievements or milestones. It wasn't the kind of life where personal growth mattered. For most citizens, work wasn't a source of pride. It was simply their reality, dictated by a society that thrived on their sacrifices. At the very least, finishing a workday in one piece was, in its own small way, a triumph. But in a city like Rome, even heading home came with its hazards. Walking through its streets was a battle in itself, one fraught with its own share of dangers and daily chaos. And that's exactly where you're headed next, into the organized chaos of Rome's streets, where life pulsed louder and messier than any workday ever could. Picture this. You step out of your insula, and within seconds, you're swallowed by the streets of ancient Rome. They're not quiet. They're alive, not in a poetic sense, but in a very literal one. The first thing you notice is movement coming from every direction. Wagons rumble past, scattering stray animals and spooking an occasional horse. Rats dart along the edges of buildings, picking at garbage that's been piling there since last night. Merchants are already shouting from their carts, each vying for attention louder than the last, as if sheer volume might make their wares more appealing. Beggars sit hunched against the walls, arms out, mumbling prayers, pleas or curses depending on how desperate they feel. And then there's the smell, sharp and sour, with layers so distinct you can practically identify them individually. Manure, spilled wine, old vomit, the tang of sweat-soaked clothing. Welcome to the streets of Rome. The first hazard you'll encounter is the ground itself, a sort of patchwork nightmare only an engineer could love. Roman roads were a triumph of practicality, perfectly straight and masterfully paved. But they were designed for efficiency, not comfort. The middle of the street carried an open sewer, a convenient channel to flush waste away using rainwater when there was rain. On most days, it resembled more of a sluggish, foul-smelling soup. Here's the thing about that sewer. Crossing from one side of the street to the other required stepping over it. There were no bridges or conveniently laid boards, just gaps in the curb that made every commute an exercise in agility and blind optimism. If you've ever had that awkward experience balancing on a single beam to avoid stepping in mud, imagine doing it over a mixture of what might generously be called organic material. Walking involves a constant dance. You dodge heaps of animal droppings, whether from the oxen pulling carts or the stray dogs loitering near market stalls. You sidestep piles of trash and puddles of liquid that you decide not to analyze too closely. But even if you manage to track your footing perfectly, you'll need to keep one eye on the carts weaving unpredictably through the chaos. Heavy cart traffic was technically banned during the day, but enforcement left something to be desired. Drivers sped furiously to deliver their loads before curfew or navigate the lawless hours of nighttime traffic. Wheels weren't exactly forgiving, and if you weren't paying attention, a sudden shove from a surging crowd might land you in their path. Crosswalks, not a thing, and speed limits, laughable. Pedestrians moved at their own risk. It wasn't just traffic though. The air itself felt like an assault on your senses. Cooking fires sent out plumes of smoke that burned faintly in your throat. From nearly every street corner, incense burned at small altars dedicated to household gods, adding the pungent smell of heavy spices. Somewhere nearby, the pervasive sourness of a public latrine lingered, a subtle nudge reminding you that sanitation wasn't exactly Rome's strong suit. And then, sometimes, the smell would hit an entirely new level. Maybe a dead animal, left to rot where it collapsed, the city offering no particular system to deal with its removal. The mix of it all was utterly overwhelming. Breathing too deeply felt imposing, but keeping your breath shallow had its limits, especially when sweat and heat layered their own contribution into the already congested atmosphere. Let's say you've managed to keep your head down and your sandals relatively clean. The people themselves present their own set of challenges. Vendors shout aggressively as you pass, thrusting fruits, fish, or tools toward you in an effort to secure your coins. Beggars call after you, rattling bowls and cups, or holding out thin, trembling hands, making sure you hear them even above the noise. You notice children weaving through the crowd, chasing each other or running errands, and sometimes they weave a little too close. Pickpockets thrived on city streets just like these. A light touch might mean you've lost a few coins or, worse, the day's entire wages. The noise is constant. It's not just merchants, it's everyone. People argue openly on the streets, their voices echoing off stone walls, whether the dispute involves personal debts or public grievances. Farmers shout as they lead sheep through the chaos. Priests chant hymns near temple entrances. Your ears catch fragments of all of it, none of it pleasant or coherent. It's not a harmonious cacophony except in one regard. It reminded you that absolutely nothing in this city could ever be called peaceful. The chaos of Rome's streets didn't evolve by accident. The city's layout wasn't kind to pedestrians, which wasn't a surprise when you realize it was designed to serve the empire's larger ambitions. The road network prioritized quick movement for armies, traders, and officials. The average person navigating these streets was never the focus. You weren't supposed to linger. Moving quickly and making way for someone else was your unwritten mandate, even if it meant shoving aside a stray goat or braving a splash from that questionable sewer water running along the center. You might think about stopping at one of the city's public fountains for some relief, a quick drink, maybe a splash of water on your face. But that too had its challenges. The fountains are shared spaces, and drinking from them involved stooping low and trusting that the person before you hadn't done anything unspeakable to the water supply. Many citizens gathered water in clay jugs for bathing or cooking, and the wealthy even hired servants to do the chore for them. But for most, this shared resource was a lifeline, and at the same time, a risk. The water could be polluted, mingled with runoff from the city, or worse, tainted by nearby waste. You had very little control or choice. Whether you drank that water or avoided it entirely, you were gambling. Even the street's infrastructure worked against you. While the paved roads themselves were solid, the spaces between buildings funneled smoke, noise, and heat into cramped alleys. On broader streets, the sheer noise of Roman life reverberated like thunder, casting each street as an open theatre of ordinary survival. This wasn't a leisurely commute. It was more like a gauntlet of sensory overload where you braced yourself for each new encounter. Success meant simply arriving somewhere roughly intact. Navigating the streets wasn't just inconvenient. It was a test of patience, persistence, and quick reflexes. Whether you were dodging a cart, stepping around waste, or diving out of the way of a careless citizen, every commute carried risk. For the poor, it was a reminder of their place in the social order. Wealthier citizens often traveled by litter or less trodden paths, avoiding the worst of the city's challenges. Most people, though, they were left to fend for themselves, weaving desperate paths through the chaos, hoping their gamble didn't leave them crushed beneath a cartwheel or drenched in the latest sewage overflow. By the time you've threaded your way through the streets, it feels like an accomplishment just to have survived. But this isn't the end. The streets of Rome, chaotic as they are, offer only a brief window into the challenges you'll face today. The next trial comes not from the movement of the city, but from its water systems, those famed aqueducts that stood as symbols of Roman engineering brilliance. And yet, as with most things in Rome, the benefits of this marvel didn't always flow equally. Rome's aqueducts were the kind of thing that made poets wax poetic. Elegant arches carrying water across miles of countryside, using little more than gravity to bring fresh water into the city. They were a symbol of power, innovation, and Roman engineering at its finest. But for the average citizen, those towering aqueducts might as well have been a cruel joke. Sure, water flowed into the city, but getting your hands on some clean, usable water was far from simple. The aqueducts were just the start of the system. The finish line was public fountains, baths, and cisterns, where the dreams of pristine water often evaporated. Most people who lived in Rome, especially those cramped into the crumbling insulae, relied on these shared fountains for their daily needs. These fountains weren't just spots to fill a jug. They were chaotic gathering places where neighbors practically jostled over access to the spouts. If you approached with a clay jar, you'd stand shoulder to shoulder with a dozen other Romans, each one muttering about how long the queue was or how slow the flow seemed today. The water wasn't free from mystery either. It traveled from those aqueducts through lead pipes, a first great leap forward in plumbing, with disastrous health side effects no one yet understood. Every swallow of that water carried risk, even if it looked clear and clean at the source. Lead poisoning wasn't just a theory, it was a very real and very common hazard. Symptoms like infertility, gout, and even madness were dangers that most couldn't link to those fancy pipes. But hindsight gives us the bitter truth. The fountains may have been functional, but they were far from sanitary. People didn't just scoop water and leave. They rinsed their hands, dipped their feet, dunked dirty children who were long overdue for a wash, and maybe even splashed their faces after a long trudge through the filthy streets. The water flowed, of course, which helped, but it didn't flow quickly enough to erase the layers of grime and germs it picked up with every passing moment. There wasn't any soap, just bare hands and an optimistic scrub, which didn't do much to cut through all the muck. In some neighborhoods, the fountains became little more than a concentrated breeding ground for bacteria, though the alternative, living without water entirely, was unthinkable. Then there were the public baths. These should have been a refuge, a place to soak, maybe relax, and let the troubles of the day wash away. Instead, they were another chaotic shared space where the dream of cleanliness collided headfirst with the reality of Roman life. Inside the baths, the water wasn't refreshed for every visitor. What entered the first pool, the caldarium, or hot bath, would circulate through a series of others, becoming progressively cooler the further it traveled. By the time it reached the frigidarium, the chilly final pool, the water had passed through everyone already soaking that day. No soap, no chlorine. Just neighbors sharing what could generously be described as diluted human residue. If that doesn't sound appealing, don't worry, it wasn't. The baths weren't just crowded, they were loud. Scrubbing and splashing were accompanied by constant chatter, booming arguments, exaggerated boasts, whispered gossips. Bathing wasn't a private or contemplative experience. It was a public ritual, one where Romans treated the baths as a social hub on par with a modern coffee shop, minus the caffeine, and with significantly worse hygiene. If you entered in search of peace, you left sorely disappointed, and with a good chance of leaving with someone else's germs. For all the bath's faults, they weren't an equal opportunity facility. People of higher status, the wealthy elite, often avoided these public spaces altogether, enjoying access to private baths in their sprawling homes. Their water came directly to them, cool, clean, and untouched by hundreds of strangers with questionable hygiene. This wasn't just about luxury, it was about avoidance. They skipped the crush of people, the risk of disease, and the frustration of shared resources. Meanwhile, regular citizens took what they could get, cramming into public baths to make the best of what was offered. The glaring inequity didn't stop at fountains or baths. It ran through the entire water system. While wealthy neighborhoods enjoyed fountains that gleamed and occasionally featured sculptures just for show, poorer neighborhoods found themselves fighting for access. Water often trickled unevenly into the city, with wealthier districts closer to main aqueducts receiving more regular supplies. Poorer areas, those neighborhoods crammed with cramped insulae, had to work harder for smaller amounts. water rationing wasn't official policy, but it often felt like it in practice. In fact, most lower-class citizens learned quickly to be suspicious about water. Its quality was unpredictable, its availability uneven. Wine, even diluted wine, was often the safer choice if you wanted to steer clear of illnesses passed through unclean water. The health risks didn't end with waterborne diseases or contact with filthy fountains. Those lead pipes lacing through every neighborhood added an invisible but insidious danger. Lead poisoning crept slowly, building in the body over time. It wasn't enough to kill instantly, which might have made the problem more obvious, but the symptoms, chronic pain, fatigue, even psychological shifts, turned daily life into a slow battle against unknowable decay. An entire city dependent on these systems stood unknowingly vulnerable to their hidden costs. And yet, the aqueducts remained a point of pride, symbols of innovation even while their impact on citizens' health remained in shadows. If you're wondering how much effort went into keeping these systems clean, the answer is not nearly enough. The shared latrines, the grit in public fountains, the overused bathwater, it all leached into the water system sooner or later, especially in lower districts where maintenance wasn't top of anyone's priority list. Contamination wasn't the exception. It was a foregone conclusion. And because the poorest citizens relied most heavily on shared spaces to meet their needs, they faced these risks daily. Access to clean water, as impressive as the aqueduct system was, often felt like a gamble, one you had no choice but to take. For all its sophistication, the Roman water system was more fragile than its grand arches and towering aqueduct bridges let on. It relied on constant upkeep, skilled operation and cooperation, all of which varied dramatically depending on which part of the city you lived in. With so many citizens crammed into Rome's narrow, chaotic streets, even the tiniest failure quickly became everyone's problem. A broken pipe, a clogged aqueduct, or stagnating fountains turned bleak inconveniences into outright crises. When water slowed, stopped, or soured, it wasn't the imperial palaces that suffered. It was the common people fighting in the streets for whatever trickled through. At first glance, Rome's aqueducts stand as monuments to ingenuity. On closer inspection, they reveal how precarious life was for the average Roman. Clean water was a privilege, shared resources were a constant source of contention, and everyone, willingly or not, participated in a system that prioritized grandeur over practicality. Visiting a fountain meant sharing more than water. Sitting in a public bath meant confronting your neighbor's bacteria as well as your own. Every sip and every soak came with risks that most Romans didn't question, but simply endured. If nothing else, this offers a reminder that ancient Rome, for all its architectural brilliance, wasn't exactly a utopia for the people keeping the city alive. The aqueducts stand tall even now, defying centuries of weather and time. But the everyday struggles they represented, the illnesses, the inequalities, the unseen dangers in what should have been life's simplest necessities, are long forgotten. Still, if you've made it through this far without cringing at least a little at the idea of bathing with Rome's masses or drinking from its public fountains, congratulations, you're halfway prepared for the next trial. Because the challenges of hygiene extended far beyond water into an even darker realm entirely: medicine. If you thought dealing with contaminated water was bad, imagine trusting your health to an era where bloodletting felt revolutionary and prayers to a god were as reliable as surgery. Let's just say if you were unwell in ancient Rome, your chances weren't great. Getting sick in ancient Rome wasn't just inconvenient, It was a gamble with some pretty terrible odds. Falling ill meant stepping straight into the chaotic, uncertain world of Roman medicine, where every diagnosis was a mix of guesswork, folklore, and the occasional pinch of logic. You weren't just battling your sickness. You were also fighting against the so-called cures that might leave you worse off than when you started. This wasn't a world of comforting bedside manners or reliable remedies. No, for most Romans, seeking medical care meant rolling the dice and hoping for the best. Roman medicine wasn't grounded in the kind of science we know today. Instead, it revolved around the belief in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humours were thought to govern every aspect of your health, and illness was just a sign that something had fallen out of balance. If you were coughing up blood or sweating through a fever, your doctor wouldn't worry about infections or germs. Instead, they'd assume your humours needed adjusting, and what better way to fix that than to drain a little blood? Bloodletting was the go-to treatment for just about everything. Whether you had a headache, a fever, or a bad attitude, slicing open a vein was often the first step in your recovery, as if losing more blood would somehow help you feel less faint. Of course, this remedy wasn't exactly gentle. There were no sterile needles or calming words about feeling a light pinch. Instead, the doctor, or more often than not, the only vaguely trained person willing to call themselves that, would take a blade or even a sharp shard of pottery and make their incision. If the sight of your own blood made you queasy, well, tough luck. The process didn't come with numbing agents, and antiseptics were completely non-existent. The risk of infection was high, but no one understood why. If the bleeding didn't help, they'd try leeches, because in Roman medicine, more blood equals fewer problems apparently. Visiting a doctor wasn't exactly a confidence-inspiring experience either. Medical professionals ranged from actual physicians who studied Greek texts to unlicensed amateurs who set up shop and called themselves healers. With no regulatory standards to speak of, you never really knew what you were signing up for. For a slight fever, you might walk away with a prescription of honey mixed with garlic, relatively harmless, if unappealing. But for anything more serious, say a broken bone or a festering wound, things got ugly fast. Surgery was sometimes an option, but only for the brave, the desperate, or the unconscious. And no, anesthesia wasn't on the menu. Picture yourself lying on a thick wooden table, clutching the edges for dear life as the surgeon pulls out a gleaming bronze scalpel. He doesn't bother softening the blow with a reassuring smile. There's no time for that. Barking orders for his assistant to hold you still, he dives right in, cutting flesh and muscle with terrifying precision as you grit your teeth and scream into the air. The only thing dulling the pain is the possibility of fainting from shock, which, honestly, might be the best case scenario. And then there was the bone drill. Yes, bone surgery was a thing in ancient Rome, but don't let the sheer advancement of it fool you. Watching, or feeling, someone bore into your leg without so much as a splash of numbing wine wasn't progress. It was torture by another name. When it came to post-operative care, infection was almost inevitable. The tools, the environment, even the hands performing the surgery weren't clean by any measure. The idea of germs wouldn't exist for centuries, so disinfecting a wound meant little more than sprinkling some crushed herbs on it and sending you home with crossed fingers. Many people didn't recover, not because their original injury was too severe, but because the infection finished what the illness started. If you were lucky, your ailment might have been treated without surgery. Roman physicians relied heavily on natural remedies. Some were relatively tame: crushed herbs, honey poultices, or vinegar rinses. Others bordered on absurd, involving ash, powdered beetles, or strange animal products you'd be too polite to ask about. For example, they believed the magic of crushed mouse bones could cure a long list of illnesses, though whether this ever worked is anyone's guess. These remedies weren't based on trials or experiments. They were passed down as tradition or inspired by sheer desperation. The gap between a cure and a wild guess was pretty thin. And when the remedies failed, which, let's be honest, they often did, Romans turned to a different healer entirely: the gods. Religion was deeply woven into medical practice, with sick individuals frequently praying to Asclepius, the god of healing, for divine intervention. If you felt especially unwell, you might make a pilgrimage to one of his temples, where you'd sleep on a mat in hopes of a miraculous overnight recovery. Dream interpretations were popular too. Priests would analyze your sleep, then suggest offerings or rituals to bring back your health. These spiritual prescriptions often came with hefty donations to the temple, which conveniently helped fund the priest's operations. And if your condition didn't improve, the gods apparently had their reasons. After all, who were you to challenge divine wisdom? When healing didn't come, neither medicine nor religion offered much in the way of closure. If someone succumbed to their illness, neighbors might gossip about whether it was the fault of the doctor, the gods, or maybe the patient for annoying some spirit along the way. Blame was easy to distribute, but understanding was scarce, and that left mourning families to light candles, whisper prayers, and move on. Seeking medical help in Rome felt more like playing a dangerous game than solving a health problem. On one hand, you could receive a remedy that only mildly improved your condition. On the other, you might find yourself losing blood unnecessarily, enduring excruciating surgeries, or succumbing to the side effects of poorly made cures. Getting better often felt like a stroke of luck, not the result of any methodical practice. Medicine, if you could call it that, was a web of faith, folklore, and fingers-crossed experimentation. So if you felt yourself coming down with something, the best strategy was often to wait it out. Drink some watered wine, chew on a stale piece of bread, and hope your body figured out the problem without intervention. For many, avoiding doctors altogether seemed the safer bet. At least there, the risks of blood loss or infection were somewhat reduced. And yet, Romans endured. They lived, they healed, sometimes miraculously, and they carried on. Their limited understanding of medicine didn't stop them from treating disease however they could. We can scoff at the quirky cures, the strange beliefs, and the crude surgeries, but it's hard not to wonder how many of us would have survived a world where illness was inevitable, and solutions were often worse than the symptoms. By the time the sun starts to set on your Roman day, you've probably dodged the worst of what illness and medicine could throw your way, for now. But you're also drained, physically and mentally. Your body is aching from the day's chaos, and your stomach is reminding you that it's time for another meal. If you're expecting dinner to be the bright spot in all this misery, don't get too excited. Because in ancient Rome, the evening meal wasn't about indulgence or celebration. It was about survival, again. And just like everything else in your day, food, too, came with its own challenges. Think dinner in ancient Rome meant reclining on marble sofas, picking at grapes, and sampling roasted peacock. Not for you, it doesn't. Unless you were wealthy enough to afford a private feast. Dinner wasn't a luxurious event. If anything, it was the bland punctuation to another exhausting day, the cena or evening meal, for the average Roman was more about function than flavor. You didn't eat to enjoy, you ate to endure. And on tonight's menu, a grim little medley of porridge, salted fish, and boiled vegetables, all of which could generously be described as edible. Maybe. Your meal usually started with poles, a simple porridge made from spelt, lentils or beans. Think oatmeal, but thicker, grainier, and significantly less appetizing. It clung to the side of the roughly thrown clay bowl it was served in, its consistency somewhere between wet cement and mashed gravel. You might poke at it with a wooden spoon, or scoop it up with a piece of stale bread if you had any left over from the morning. The taste, it depended entirely on what you could add to it. A little sprinkle of herbs or a pinch of salt might save it from being completely bland, but it wasn't going to win any culinary awards. Survivable was the best review most could hope for. Protein, if it made an appearance, came salted and tough. Cheap cuts of fish, dried to an almost leathery texture and preserved with enough salt to burn your tongue, were common. Salt preservation was essential for food that needed to last, but it didn't do your palate any favors. Every bite came with a mouthful of brine, making watered-down wine an unavoidable necessity to keep from drying out entirely. If you were lucky, there might be a bit of garum to liven things up. Garum was a fermented fish sauce prized in Roman cooking, a salty, pungent liquid that added what can only be described as an acquired taste. Unfortunately, its smell, described in ancient sources as dead ocean, did little to enhance the dining experience. Still, it was better than nothing, and nothing wasn't unusual. Vegetables, boiled and mushy, rounded out the plate. Carrots, leeks, or beets, if you could find them, piled together in softened heaps that had long since surrendered their crispness to the cooking fire. By the time they made it to the table, they barely resembled their original forms. Forget seasoning or creative preparation. If the vegetables weren't completely scorched, you considered it a small win. Tomatoes, potatoes, and anything containing sugar, all absent without leave. This wasn't cuisine as you know it. The ingredients available in ancient Rome were a far cry from what's stocked in your local grocery store. And without modern spices or sweeteners, the meal lacked anything resembling comfort or indulgence. This simple array, poles, salted fish, and boiled greens, was plated communally. Forget about individual servings or personal plates. A single platter sat in the middle of the group, and everyone dug in together. It wasn't unheard of for tensions to rise during meals. If resources were scarce, or someone seemed to take more than their share, an argument wasn't far behind. Napkins? You're kidding, right? Hands were wiped on a shared cloth, if you were lucky, or more often, on your tunic. Hygiene wasn't a top priority, and the shared approach to dining just highlighted how raw and unfiltered meals were for the lower classes. You weren't sitting at a dining table either. Rather, you might be perched on a rough stool or squatting on the floor, doing your best to keep your balance while you ate. The smells around the table reflected the simplicity of the meal. Garlic, heavily used to add flavor, lingered on everyone's breath. Mixed with the general air of unwashed bodies, sweat, and food scraps. The scent of dinner wasn't something you looked forward to. There wasn't conversation, at least not the leisurely kind. The focus stayed squarely on eating, cleaning up, and moving on. Any sense of indulgence that might come with an evening meal was reserved for the wealthiest citizens, whose idea of cena couldn't be more different. If you'd taken a seat at a senator's table, for example, the difference would have been staggering. Exotic dishes like stuffed dormice, flamingo, or boiled jellyfish might have graced the table, accompanied by fresh fruits, rare spices, and imported wine. These menus weren't just indulgent, they were statements of wealth and power. Food wasn't just nutrient, it was status, a reminder of what money could buy. But down here, in the shadow of towering insulae, you weren't working with flamingos or pomegranates. You were just trying to fill your stomach enough to sleep through the night without waking in a haze of hunger. Preservation techniques were part of the problem. Fresh meat and produce were luxuries for most Romans, leaving the majority to rely on preserved, dried, or heavily salted foods that could last through sweltering summers. Nutritional value wasn't something anyone calculated, though you might feel its absence over time, your body growing weaker from a steady diet of repetition and scarcity. For dessert, if it even existed, you might get a handful of dried figs or nuts. On most occasions, though, the meal ended in silence, empty bowls left as a testament to the daily grind of survival. Wine, watered down throughout the day, played its usual supporting role. Clean water wasn't a guarantee, especially in poor neighborhoods, so mixing it with wine added a layer of safety, or at least the illusion of it. By the time the clay cup passed through your hands, the drink was more water than anything, with just a hint of wine left to remind you what it used to be. It went down flat, mild, and as lifeless as the meal itself. For all its simplicity, dinner reflected the social stratification of ancient Rome, perhaps more than any other part of daily life. Food divided people just as much as marble walls and silk tunics did. The lavish feasts of the elite sat in stark contrast to the gritty, repetitive meals of the working class. For the poor, food wasn't a pleasure, it was a necessity. And even that necessity often felt just out of reach. By the time you finished your cena, the faintest ache of satisfaction might settle in, but only faint. It never really crossed into fullness or comfort. Dinner didn't close your day with a sense of peace or joy. It simply ended a chapter, preparing you for whatever came next. Sleep, if you were lucky, or the chaos of Rome's nightlife if you weren't. Because unlike the dim glow of modern evenings, Roman nights were loud, unpredictable, and often dangerous. Fires lit up the streets, thieves hid in the shadows, and the unfortunate reality of living stacked so closely meant the peace and quiet you craved after dinner rarely came. And so, as you scrape the last bit of porridge from your bowl, you can't help but think about the hours ahead. The streets, already unkind by day, transformed into something far more intimidating under moonlight. Celebrations spilled into alleyways. Street performers competed with the sounds of drunken arguments. Public order took a back seat, leaving you to navigate the blurred lines between entertainment and danger. Dinner may be behind you now, but survival, that's still very much on the menu. When the sun finally set on Rome, the chaos of the day didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. The city never really slept. Instead, it morphed into a darker, unrulier version of itself. By nightfall, the streets belonged to a mix of performers, drinkers, criminals, and anyone willing to take the risks of venturing out after dark. Without the hum of daily commerce to distract you, Rome's imperfections became even more obvious. Lights? Rare. Most relied on the moon and scattered torches, their flickering flames barely enough to push back the shadows. Walking alone made you an easy target. Staying in wasn't much better, but at least the dangers inside your insula were predictable ones. Let's start with entertainment, because for Romans seeking relief from the grind, there was no shortage of spectacles. The Colosseum, which by now was an infamous part of the Roman experience, wasn't just a daytime attraction. While most of its blood-drenched gladiatorial matchups took place during sunlight hours, the arena occasionally hosted nighttime games too, a fact designed to amp up their exotic appeal for the crowds. Imagine this: packed stone seats lit by torchlight, spectators draped in threadbare cloaks or fine togas, shouting over each other as gladiators clashed below. The sand wasn't golden under moonlight, but darkened by blood, yet the energy of the crowd drowned out anything resembling hesitation. The cheers weren't just for courage, they were for carnage. It wasn't always just swords and shields combat either. These late games often included wild animal hunts, public executions, or elaborate recreations of great naval battles, with the arena flooded to accommodate ships. Attendance was entirely free, at least for the poor, who piled into the cheapest seats high above. The elite, of course, occupied the best spots closest to the action, staying just far enough away that stray blood wouldn't make it up to their sandals. And while the spectacle was undoubtedly gruesome, it worked. It distracted the masses. The government sponsored these events to keep people occupied with excitement instead of resentment. Let the Senate raise taxes or spread the empire's influence. No one in the nosebleed seats cared, while a tiger was mauling a condemned prisoner down below. Theatres offered a more civil, if no less chaotic option. Comedy, tragedy, farce. There was something for everyone, depending on how much you wanted to laugh or weep that evening. Crowds showed up loudly, filling the air with lively chatter and the occasional scuffle when someone refused to share their seat. Street performers gathered outside theatres, breathing fire or juggling crude torches to coax a few coins from tipsy patrons. If you were too poor to afford admission or uninterested in formal entertainment, there were always the streets, full of their own free shows. Musicians strummed lyres, acrobats balanced precariously on rough ropes, and con artists entertained small groups with tricks that left onlookers coinless when the crowd dispersed. Rowdier still were the drinking establishments, simple wine shops tucked into the winding streets and alleys of Rome. Here, the tables were sticky from spilled drinks, and the air was heavy with the fumes of cheap wine. Men leaned close over wooden counters, shouting slurred anecdotes or betting the day's wages on arm wrestling matches. These weren't the sophisticated gatherings of the wealthy, complete with carefully aged wines and polished silver goblets. No, these were spots for ordinary Romans, their cups filled with the thin, sour posca that passed for drinkable wine among the lower classes. Around these places, brawls could erupt at any moment. A stray insult about another man's team at the Circus Maximus, for example, might explode into a scuffle before anyone even finished their round. And then there were the dangers that lurked in the streets themselves. Thieves and pickpockets roamed freely after dark, waiting for the careless or unlucky to stumble away from an evening out. Without streetlights or more than scattered flames to brighten the path, every shadow became a hiding spot for someone desperate or malicious. Even the vigils, Rome's night watchmen, put up little resistance to the nightly chaos. They were underpaid, poorly organized, and frequently caught napping on the job, rendering them far more decorative than useful. Many people gave up on expecting real security from them, and instead avoided traveling at night altogether, unless there was no choice. Fire was perhaps the greatest fear of all. The insulae, those towering, overcrowded blocks of apartments made of cheap wood and unstable brick, were practically begging to go up in flames. All it took was one poorly handled oil lamp or a cooking fire left smouldering, and an entire block could be reduced to cinders before morning. Fires spread so quickly that residents often had no time to gather their few belongings. fleeing down stairs that crumbled beneath them as they ran. The vigils carried tools for fighting these fires, buckets and rudimentary pumps, but when a blaze engulfed an area, their efforts were little more than symbolic. Waking to the smell of smoke in the dead of night was a nightmare that most Romans couldn't escape. Lives were lost, and homes were never rebuilt quite the same way. Through all of this, the noise was endless. If you'd hoped for a quiet dinner followed by a peaceful night's rest, tough luck. The streets were alive with the clatter of carts, the cries of vendors still hawking goods to late-night customers, and the drunken songs of revelers staggering home. Those thin walls of the insulae didn't help. Inside, you could hear every sound. The couple down the hall arguing over spilled water, the faint scratching of rodents eager to get into your grain stores, even the baby crying 2 floors above as his parents argued about who should quiet it. Sleep, if it came at all, was shallow and restless. You lay on a straw mat riddled with lice, your ears catching every creak of the insula around you, wondering if you'd wake to shouts of fire or the sudden crash of a collapsing ceiling. On the hotter nights, the smell of sweat, mildew and smoke hung so heavily in the air that even the faintest breeze couldn't cut through it. And yet, despite the giant list of discomforts, you slept because you had no choice. Your body needed the briefest reprieve from the endless churn of Roman life, even if rest was as elusive as a decent meal. This chaos wasn't accidental. Rome's nightlife, its brawls and spectacles and sleepless streets, served a purpose bigger than entertainment. For the poorest citizens, it was a momentary escape from the crushing burdens of daily life. A night at the Colosseum watching the sand stain red or a cheap bottle of wine shared at a grimy table was enough to numb the mind, even if just for an evening. The empire benefited too. Keeping the masses distracted meant keeping them under control. It's hard to focus on revolt when all your energy is spent navigating the dangers of the day, let alone staying awake long enough to get through the night. So, as the moon climbed higher over Rome, you slipped into a fitful sleep, swirling in dreams of the Colosseum's violence, the street's chaos, and the fire-scorched walls of your insula. Tomorrow, the same struggles waited for you, the same stale bread, the same crowded streets, the nightly spectacle of Roman life, as unpredictable and unsafe as it felt, still capped each day with its strange, unrelenting rhythm. There was no time to savor beauty or find true peace, not when the city itself seemed determined to test its citizens at every turn. All you could do was endure. The Roman Empire wasn't built on comfort. It wasn't gold or marble that kept it standing. It was grit. Despite grueling days filled with poverty, disease, and danger, its people endured. They built roads that spanned continents, aqueducts that defied time, and ideas that shaped democracies. Latin, their language, branched into half the tongues we speak today, spreading their influence far beyond their own borders. Their lives were a grind, made of sweat, fear, and constant adaptation. Yet that grind carried them forward. So tonight, as you lie on soft pillows with clean water nearby, take a quiet moment of gratitude.